You really think that old man has a story to tell? The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a challenge. The young pilot, Lieutenant Charlie, sneered as he watched the frail figure shuffle into the hangar, carrying nothing more than a small, worn duffel bag. The man was clearly out of place, an elderly stranger who had somehow wandered into the realm of cutting-edge military technology, an area reserved for the elite. The other pilots laughed quietly, mocking the old man's presence. They were about to take off in their F-35s, machines of unparalleled power, while this senior citizen was simply here, seemingly lost. Captain James Hawk Pierce, the squadron leader, rolled his eyes, making it clear that he was unimpressed. "What is this? The new mechanic?" he quipped. "Old enough to have served in Vietnam, maybe, but definitely too old to be anywhere near these jets." The others laughed. Charlie took another step forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Grandpa, you got a call sign? Or are you just here to watch us work our magic?" The old man didn't answer. He simply walked past them, his eyes focused on something in the distance. His movements were slow but purposeful, as if every step carried a weight that others couldn't even begin to understand. The pilots shared another chuckle. "What's the worst that could happen?" one of them murmured. A few moments later, the sound of a low, rumbling voice broke the laughter. "Ugly Six." It was quiet at first, just a whisper that made Hawk pause. His eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He had heard that call sign before, but it couldn't be. He turned around, his gaze locking onto the old man, who stood there, motionless. The air in the hangar seemed to freeze. The quiet murmur of the crew turned to silence, as if the entire room held its breath. "Ugly Six," Hawk repeated under his breath. The name carried weight, history, a legacy. It was the call sign of a living legend, a pilot who had flown the most dangerous missions, someone who had seen things no one else ever would. His eyes flickered to the worn duffel bag at the old man's feet, and a sudden realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some old veteran lost in time. This was someone who had been a part of history, someone who had shaped it. The pilots around him started to shift uncomfortably, their casual smugness evaporating into a nervous energy. Charlie took a step back, his face flushing red. He had mocked a legend, a man who had flown through hell and back. A chill ran down his spine. "Hawk, what's going on?" one of the other pilots asked, his voice suddenly uneasy. Hawk didn't answer. He knew what was happening. He had underestimated the old man, just like the rest of them. The silence in the room deepened, and the tension was palpable. Hawk stepped forward, his voice now steady, full of respect. "Gentlemen, this is John Miller, UGLY-6. His words carried the weight of respect, of awe, of something much deeper than they had ever expected. "I think we owe him an apology." Hawk couldn't believe what he was hearing. The room was completely still, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The young pilots who had been so sure of themselves, mocking the old man just moments ago, were now frozen in place. The whispers stopped. The hum of the hangar, the sound of jets being prepared for flight, all faded into the background. John Miller, standing in front of them, was no longer just an old veteran. He was Ugly Six. The call sign carried a weight that no one could ignore. Hawk took a step forward, his chest tightening as the gravity of the situation settled in. "Gentlemen," he started, his voice firm, "this is John Miller. You've heard the stories. You've seen the medals." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The pilots exchanged uneasy glances, their previous confidence slowly slipping away. Charlie, the same one who had mocked the old man moments before, shifted uncomfortably. His face was flushed with embarrassment, his hands trembling slightly. He had no idea what kind of legend stood before him. But now he knew. Miller was a living legend, a man whose call sign was more than just a title. It was a symbol of his unmatched experience, his unshakable resolve, and his contributions to the military that would never be forgotten. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of realization. Hawk took another step closer to John Miller, his posture straightening, his respect for the man growing with every passing second. "You were right to not say a word when we mocked you. You didn't need to. Your silence speaks louder than any words could ever do," Hawk continued, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Charlie swallowed hard. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the sting of shame creeping up his neck. He had never felt more foolish in his life. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. John Miller simply nodded, his expression calm, his eyes steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't resentful. He was a man who had seen it all, who had lived through the chaos of war and the quiet of retirement. He had nothing to prove. He wasn't here to seek validation from anyone. The respect, the apology, was implicit in the air around him. Slowly, one by one, the young pilots began to realize what had just happened. They had witnessed a moment of true humility, a lesson in grace and strength. Hawk turned to face them, his voice now commanding. "This is why we serve," he said. "Not for the recognition, but for the duty." John Miller is a reminder that no matter how far we rise, we must never forget where we came from. This man, this legend, has earned every bit of respect we can offer him, and we will honor that from here on out. The pilots stood still, their faces somber, their earlier arrogance replaced by a newfound reverence. John Miller had shown them that true strength wasn't in the power of their machines or their rank, but in the silent strength of a man who had been there when it mattered most. As the room quieted, the sound of the jets outside became the only noise that remained. Hawk nodded to Miller, signaling that it was time to go. "We'll never forget this, sir," he said, and with that, the pilots turned to prepare for the flight ahead, carrying with them a lesson they would never forget. The next few minutes passed in a haze of movement, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. As the pilots finished preparing their jets, they went through their final checks in a much quieter, more focused way than before. The energy had shifted. The once lively and joking atmosphere had been replaced by something more solemn, respectful. Even the noise of the hangar, the constant hum of machinery, seemed distant now, as if the world outside had fallen away. Charlie, still embarrassed, kept glancing over at John Miller, who was sitting quietly in the corner, as calm and still as ever. There was no fanfare, no grand gesture, just the presence of someone who had lived through it all. It was as if the old man was more of a force of nature than a person. Hawk gave one last look at his team before he walked over to where Miller sat. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of humility. Here was a man who had lived through wars, who had sacrificed more than anyone would ever know, and yet, he didn't ask for anything. He was just there. Hawk stood in front of him for a moment before speaking. "Sir, I don't know what to say. We should have known. You've earned this." Miller looked up at him, his eyes steady but kind. "No need to apologize, son. This isn't about me. It's about remembering that we all have our place in this world, and that even the smallest things can make a difference when the time comes." Hawk nodded, his throat tight. He realized then that Miller wasn't just a legend. He was a reminder of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to never forget the value of humility. The younger pilots finished their preparations, and the engines of the F-35s roared to life. Hawk turned back to his team. "Let's get in the air," he said, his voice filled with renewed purpose. As they boarded their jets and taxied down the runway, the reality of the situation finally hit Hawk. The flight wasn't just about completing a mission anymore. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about honoring the legacy of those who had come before them, about remembering that true strength wasn't in the machines they flew, but in the people who had shaped the military into what it was. The jets lifted into the sky, cutting through the clouds, but for Hawk, it was no longer just a routine mission. It was a tribute to a man who had lived through the darkest of times, and yet carried himself with grace and dignity. The story of John Miller, Ugly Six, would stay with him and his team forever. The flight was smooth, the roar of the engines a constant hum beneath them, but Hawk couldn't shake the image of John Miller sitting silently in the hangar, a reminder of everything he had yet to understand. His hands gripped the controls with a new sense of purpose, and the cockpit around him felt more like a sacred space than just a seat in a fighter jet. He glanced to his right, where his co-pilot, Lieutenant Andrea, was focused on the mission, but even she seemed aware of the shift. The usual banter was missing. There were no jokes, no quips. They were flying as a team, but it felt like they were carrying something heavier, something more significant. Hawk had flown countless missions. His name had become known in the Air Force, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the realization that hit him earlier. The true weight of history was not found in medals or rank. It was found in the quiet strength of men like John Miller, who had done the hard work, fought the battles, and never asked for the world's recognition. As the jets sliced through the clouds, Hawk's mind wandered back to the moment when he had called out Miller's call sign. The way the air had thickened, how every word from Miller had carried more weight than anything he'd heard in his years as a pilot. It was humbling. Charlie, the young pilot who had mocked Miller so thoughtlessly, had been the most shaken. Hawk had seen it in his eyes. A mix of guilt, awe, and disbelief. Charlie wasn't the only one, though. Every pilot in that hangar had felt something shift. They had all heard the stories, but none of them had truly understood the magnitude of the legend standing before them. The older pilots had known, of course. They had served alongside Miller, and they had seen his name whispered with reverence in the hallways of their base. But to see him in person, to feel the weight of his legacy, it changed things. Hawk's voice broke through the radio silence. "We're hitting our coordinates. Everyone, stay sharp." He didn't need to say much more. They were all alert, their minds on the mission ahead, but part of him wondered how this moment would echo in their lives. Would they remember this mission for its tactical success, or would they remember the lesson of respect that Miller had taught them without uttering a single harsh word? As they neared the target, Hawk's heart pounded. This wasn't just another mission. This was a chance to prove that the lessons they learned in the air didn't just apply to flying jets. They applied to life. And with that thought, he pulled the trigger, leading his team into action, not just as pilots, but as men who had learned to honor the past, to recognize the quiet strength of those who came before them. They were no longer just soldiers in the sky. They were part of a legacy, and that legacy would stay with them, guiding their every move from that day forward. The mission ended smoothly, the jets returning to base as planned. But as Hawk touched down and taxied toward the hangar, he couldn't shake the thought of what had happened earlier. The mission was over, but the lessons they'd learned that day were just beginning to settle in. The pilots went through the usual debrief, but even as they discussed the tactical execution, there was a noticeable shift in the air. Charlie was quieter than usual, his eyes downcast, his mind clearly elsewhere. Hawk noticed it, but he didn't press him. Some things had to be processed in their own time. As the debrief came to an end, Hawk made his way to the hangar, his thoughts still on John Miller. The old man hadn't spoken much after the call sign was revealed, but Hawk felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lesson he had unknowingly imparted. The legacy of men like Miller wasn't just about the glory of battle or the medals they wore. It was about the quiet strength, the unwavering resolve to stand tall even when the world didn't notice. Hawk stood in the hangar for a moment, looking out at the planes that were being readied for the next flight. The engines were quiet now, the hum of activity less frantic. It felt almost peaceful, the calm after the storm. And yet, the storm wasn't really over. The pilots had been changed, and Hawk knew that. It wasn't just the respect they had learned to give Miller. It was the understanding that their duty as pilots went beyond the cockpit. It was about carrying that respect, that integrity, into everything. They did. As Hawk walked toward the office to submit his flight report, Charlie approached him. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. Hawk turned, surprised by the sincerity in Charlie's voice. "For what?" he asked, genuinely curious. "For the lesson," Charlie replied. "I didn't get it before, but I understand now." Hawk smiled, nodding. "Good," he said. "We all learn something every day. And today, we learned that it's not just about the mission. It's about honoring the men who paved the way for us." Charlie nodded, and Hawk could see the change in him. It wasn't immediate, but it was there. The young pilot had learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. As Hawk sat down to fill out his report, he couldn't help but reflect on what he had witnessed. The mission was over, but the real work had only just begun. It wasn't enough to be a good pilot. To truly honor the legacy of men like Miller, they had to be better, not just in the air, but in how they carried themselves every day. They had to be men of honor, humility, and respect. And that was the real mission. Days passed since the mission, but the shift in the air lingered. Hawk could feel it every time he walked into the hangar or sat down with his team. There was a subtle change in the way they interacted, a deeper level of respect now woven into their conversations. The pilots were more focused, more aware of the weight they carried as servicemen. It wasn't something that could be easily explained, but it was there, in the quiet moments between missions, in the glances exchanged when a story of the past was brought up. The change wasn't just in the pilots. It was in the way the entire squadron carried themselves. Charlie, once the loudest and most cocky, had become someone different. He spoke less, but when he did, it was with purpose. His previous arrogance had been replaced with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from knowing you had learned something vital, something that couldn't be measured in the flight logs. Hawk noticed the difference in himself as well. The cocky pilot who had once flown through the skies with a sense of invincibility was now more grounded. His decisions felt more thoughtful, less driven by the adrenaline of the moment, and more by the desire to live up to the example set by John Miller. As the days turned into weeks, the squadron continued their training, their missions, but something had shifted. The younger pilots began to ask more questions, not just about the jets they flew, but about the history of the men who had flown before them. Hawk found himself telling stories, not of battle or combat, but of men like Miller, of those who had come before them and paved the way. It wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about something deeper, something that connected them to the past, to the traditions of honor, respect, and sacrifice that made them more than just soldiers. The air had changed in the hangar, but the most significant change was the one that had occurred inside each of them. The next mission came, as they always did. But as Hawk prepared his jet, he felt a sense of calm he had never experienced before. He wasn't worried about completing the task. He wasn't focused on how fast or how precisely he could execute the mission. He was thinking about the legacy he was a part of, the history that flowed through him and his team. And that was enough to give him everything he needed to succeed. The mission was a success, of course. But for Hawk, it wasn't about the mission itself. It was about how they had approached it. They had done it with the humility and respect they had learned from Miller, from the men and women who had shaped them. As they touched down, Hawk knew this wasn't just another mission. It was the start of something new, a new chapter in their careers, a new way of thinking. And as they taxied back to the hangar, Hawk looked out at the planes, knowing that the legacy of John Miller would live on in the hearts and minds of every pilot who flew there. The squadron had been on edge ever since that mission. Hawk could feel it every time he entered the hangar. The usual buzz of activity, the chatter between pilots, all of it had changed. It wasn't just about the flights anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had begun to grow in them since Miller had left his mark. He could see it in the way Charlie spoke to the younger pilots now. The arrogance was gone. The mockery that had once been his trademark had faded. In its place was something quieter, something that made the younger pilots pay attention when he spoke. Hawk had seen this shift in himself too. His approach to leadership had softened, but in a way that made him stronger. The respect for his team had grown, and it wasn't just about executing the perfect mission anymore. It was about being a team, understanding the value each member brought, no matter how young or old. As the next set of missions came in, Hawk found himself reflecting on the story of Miller, the lessons that man had unknowingly imparted to them. It wasn't just about serving the country. It was about carrying a legacy. Every pilot in the squadron was now a part of that legacy, a piece of history that they could never forget. They were no longer just a team of pilots. They were the embodiment of all those who had served before them, who had laid the foundation for them to fly those jets. One afternoon, as the sun set over the base, Hawk took a moment to sit outside the hangar. The sounds of the base quieted, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. The aircraft were lined up on the tarmac, their engines quiet for the night. In the distance, he saw Charlie, sitting alone on a bench, looking out toward the horizon. Hawk knew what was on his mind. The younger pilot had changed, and it wasn't because of some sudden revelation. It was because he had seen something in Miller, a man who had walked a path that none of them could truly understand, but all of them respected. Hawk got up and walked over to him, sitting down beside him. For a few minutes, neither of them said a word. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding, from shared experience. Finally, Charlie spoke. "I never really thought about it, he said, his voice quieter than usual. "About what it means to really serve, I mean." Hawk nodded. "It's not about the rank or the medals. It's about who you are when no one's watching. It's about living up to the responsibility, not because you have to, but because it's the right thing to do." Charlie turned to him, his eyes thoughtful. "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I get it now." The next mission came a few days later, and the squadron was ready. They weren't just prepared to complete the task. They were prepared to do it with honor, with the respect that Miller had taught them. As they climbed into their jets and soared into the sky, Hawk felt a sense of peace he had never known before. They weren't just pilots. They were part of something much bigger, something that could never be measured in flight hours or missions completed. They were carrying the legacy of those who had come before them, and they would carry it with pride for as long as they flew. Weeks had passed since that mission, but the lessons learned continued to resonate. The squadron's atmosphere had evolved into something deeper, more grounded. Every pilot now moved through the base with a sense of quiet pride, knowing that what they did wasn't just about flying. It was about something much bigger. Hawk had seen this shift in every member of his team. They were more aware of their responsibilities, not just as pilots, but as men who carried the weight of their history. Charlie, who had once been the loudest, most brash of them all, now walked with a newfound confidence. He didn't need to prove himself through words anymore. His actions spoke louder than anything he could say. The same could be said for Hawk himself. He had always been a skilled pilot, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer saw himself as just someone who flew a jet. He saw himself as part of a greater legacy, one that had been built by men who had come before him and paved the way. As the squadron prepared for their next mission, Hawk felt a sense of calm. It wasn't the usual rush of excitement he once felt before takeoff. This time, it was different. There was a quiet certainty in him that they would succeed, not because they were the best pilots, but because they had learned to honor the values that made them strong. They had learned humility, respect, and the importance of working as a team. The mission brief came in, and the pilots gathered for their usual briefing. Hawk watched as they all sat, their focus razor-sharp. They were ready, not just to carry out the mission, but to do so with integrity. As the briefing ended and they suited up for takeoff, Hawk couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The change had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but now it was undeniable. They weren't just flying to complete a mission. They were flying to honor something bigger than themselves. Hawk gave one last look at Charlie, who had become a symbol of the transformation within the squadron. Charlie gave him a quick nod, his eyes focused, calm. The younger pilot had embraced the lessons of the past, and now he was ready to carry them forward, just like the rest of them. As the engines roared to life and the jets sped down the runway, Hawk felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just thinking about the mission. He was thinking about the men who had come before them and the legacy they carried. As they soared into the sky, the squadron flew not just as a team of pilots, but as a symbol of honor, respect, and tradition. And with every mile they flew, Hawk knew they were carrying the weight of something much greater than themselves. The weeks that followed the mission continued to shape the squadron, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had been unlocked in each of them. They had become more than just a team of pilots. They were a living, breathing representation of everything they had learned and everything that had come before them. Every time Hawk walked into the hangar, he could feel the shift. The younger pilots were different now. They didn't just ask questions about their equipment, about the mission. They asked about the stories, the history, the experiences that had shaped the men who had come before them. Charlie had come the furthest. Once a cocky, hot-headed pilot, he was now the first to offer a helping hand, the first to speak up with respect. Hawk could see the change in him every time they spoke. The weight of the call sign Ugly Six had settled into Charlie's understanding of what it meant to be a part of something bigger. He didn't just wear the uniform anymore. He understood what it represented. As Hawk walked through the hangar, preparing for their next mission, he saw the same growth in every pilot. They weren't the same group of young men that had laughed off an old veteran just weeks ago. Now, they were a squadron forged in the lessons of humility and respect. They had come to understand that flying jets wasn't just about speed and precision. It was about carrying the legacy of those who had come before them. It was about remembering that they weren't alone in the skies, that they were a part of something much larger than any individual. The mission that day was simple enough, but for Hawk, it felt different. As the jets lifted off the ground, there was a quiet confidence in every maneuver. No one was rushing. No one was trying to outdo each other. They were flying as one, moving through the air like a single unit. Even the most complicated tasks felt easy because they had become more than just a team. They had become a family. The mission came and went without incident, but the real victory wasn't in the success of the operation. It was in the way the squadron had come together. Hawk knew that the work they had done in the air was just the beginning. The real work was in how they carried themselves, how they treated each other, how they honored the legacy of those who had flown before them. As they returned to base, Hawk looked out at the jets on the tarmac, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to serve. It wasn't about the medals or the accolades. It was about the quiet strength of standing together, of honoring the men who had walked the path before them, and of carrying that responsibility with pride. And as Hawk walked back into the hangar, he knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. A journey where they would carry the lessons of Miller and the generations before him, and where they would continue to honor that legacy, not just with their skills, but with their hearts.